We tried to bring you some interviews with folks from Randall Williams, the Director of Health, and now Senator Caleb Rowden, the Majority Leader in the Missouri Senate. Thanks for making the time.
You bet.
We're here in Columbia, sans Mizzou helmet and everything else.
I like it.
First of all, how's you and your family doing?
Everybody's good. We're surviving and practicing social distancing and staying home more than not. But everybody's healthy at the moment, and we're actually enjoying spending a little more time than we normally spend together during session, and that's been fun. We've been building forts and bunch of fun stuff that we've been doing together. So that part's been good.
You have two young kids, right?
Two young kids. Willem's 7 and Adele is about 15 months.
15 months. Let's just start with the top. So the state's response, it's been more of a localized response.
Yeah.
I've seen Brian Treese here be active, and you have more cases than maybe a rural county here in Columbia. Sure. I thought it was particularly advantageous to the college to not come back after spring break. I mean, you think about all the people going throughout the country, then coming back to Columbia. That seemed like a recipe for disaster for folks in your district. Give me your take on the response Missouri's had thus far.
Yeah, I think the first thing I tried to tell folks in some of the communication that we put out was, it's going to be really, really easy, and you're going to feel the urge to want to second guess every decision that's made by anybody. And there will be a time for that. We'll get beyond it, and it'll warrant a discussion about what we did right and what we did wrong at every level. But doing it in the middle of it, just for the purpose of making the other guy look bad or saying that it was not something that I was going to do. And so there have been things that folks have done at the local level that I've agreed and disagreed with, things done at the state level that I've agreed and disagreed with, and we can have that conversation at some point. But it wasn't something that I felt like I needed to get up and use my bullhorn to make that known. I think the response has been sufficient up until now. We don't know what we don't know. I mean, I think that's the thing that has really been interesting for me in being in the role that I am in, and the discussions we're having about how we get back into session and even all of these things. I mean, this is unprecedented, uncharted, and so you're making decisions that most people never thought they would have to make, and so there has to be a little bit of grace extended there in those moments, and so I've tried to do that, and when a bad decision is made that could be rectified in the moment, if I can have that conversation with somebody one-on-one, I've done that, and that we've had that conversation a few times.
The chamber that you led, I thought it was interesting. There was a Wednesday night. You were debating a Wayfair tax policy bill. It's felt like that debate was going to go, maybe not all night, but certainly later than. Yeah. I think I was surprised when you started hearing that a caucus was going to be called. And even when you canceled session for the following week, I think there was a lot of people that thought maybe that was the local reaction. Yeah. 2 hours later, the NBA canceled, and then the NHL, and the next day baseball. You're one of the first bodies that I know of that made that decision. Walk me through the discussion in your caucus and your internal thoughts on why you made that decision. You made it before anybody else did.
Yeah, it started with a couple of kind of one-on-one, one-off conversations with individual senators who expressed some concerns about where they thought this might be headed. Obviously, our situation is somewhat unique in the fact that we have people coming in that building every day from all over the state, and sometimes from all over the country. People fly in to testify, and we don't know where they came from. So there were those variables are not variables that we have any ability to control, and so that was part of the expressed concern by some of our folks. And so I talked to Senator Schatz. We said, let's have a caucus. Let's talk about it. Let's decide what we want to do. And so the caucus, I think, there were certainly folks who kind of took the angle and the mindset, which I understand, that, hey, we're public servants and this is important stuff, and there are other people on the front lines that are being forced to continue to do their jobs. We should do that, and I think that is a perfectly reasonable position to take. It was just that more of our folks recognized the potential vulnerability there and said, hey, let's take a week. Then we get spring break, which was already scheduled, and then we'll come back and reevaluate once we know more.
And honestly, even if you hadn't decided to make that decision that night, there's no chance you would have been in session Monday anyway, as the facts started.
Yeah, probably not. And I think the worst case scenario in that, or whatever case scenario out of that conversation would have been, hey, if you don't feel comfortable coming, don't come. and we'll have session, but is there any guarantee that we would have had a quorum at that point? I don't know. I don't know who would have come and who would have not. But I think we feel good about the decision we made. I don't fault anybody for making the other decision or for thinking that what we did was wrong. Again, we're all making decisions in moments that we never expected to be in.
So talk about coming back. I understand there's some plans to come back and take up the supplemental appropriation.
Yeah, so we actually have been working with MU Health, which I tweeted about that last week. Cole County Public Health, Boone County Public Health has been involved. We gave them kind of the parameters of our building, some of which they knew about, some of which they didn't. They came back with a plan that we got in our hands yesterday that's very involved, very good, very science-based as far as some things that we can do. And so we're having conversations with the governor's office, Commissioner Steelman's office, the House, the Senate, Capitol Police, anybody who would have a role in that, and just figuring out, all right, here's what we can implement, here's what we should implement, here's additional steps that we can take based on our knowledge. So I'm hoping we won't be in next week by virtue mostly of the fact that the governor decided to shut down the Capitol, and so we could still meet, but then you run into issues with having those meetings be public, and can the media be there, and public sunshine law. So there's some issues there, and so we said let's get past the 6th, and so I think there's a chance we're going to try to put everything in place as far as some of these safeguards to come in on the 6th, and if nothing else, pass supplemental, pass the FRA.
When you come in on the 6th, will the gallery, will people be able to come watch?
So I think that part of the plan, and I'm still looking through this, but I think part of the plan is that yes, they have to be able to come. I think if they choose to, we're going to strongly discourage them from coming, and we're going to offer additional ways to see and hear what we're doing. The House already does it.
Will this be televised?
We're working on that, and we think we're going to be able to get that done even in the next couple of weeks. Yeah, I do. I always have.
For general sessions?
Yes. Yeah. I think that's something that the upside is better than the downside. The downside, in full disclosure, is that sometimes we say dumb stuff, and so does that get used against you in your next campaign? And so that's the argument against. The argument for is, look, this is the people's work, it's the people's body, and I think they should be able to see and hear what we're doing. But
there's been talk about maybe having a vote, people could come in the chamber. I mean, I always thought it was important for the Senate and the esteem of it to operate it normally. Will it be normal where everybody can come listen to any part of the debate they want?
Yeah, I think so. Part of what we're going to try to do is route members of the public certain ways to get them up to the gallery. Obviously, there will be more room between those individuals up in the gallery, so fewer people in theory will be able to be up there. But route them certain ways. Members are going to stay in their offices. We probably will change the way that we vote a little bit, in that potentially the roll will be called much slower, which will give folks time to come from their office, come in the chamber, make their vote, go back out. All of those sorts of things. And I think the House is looking potentially at doing something similarly with more 1 or 2 at a time type of votes, as opposed to just one group vote. And so, there are some things that we can do. Are we foolproof? Are we going to not have any risk of exposure by anybody? No, absolutely not. But I do think there is some value in the conversation, in the view that this is important work. And certainly passing the supplemental and getting some of that federal money down is tremendously important right now.
Tim in Farmington had a question. If you do come back, let's say you have 2 weeks of session left, what are some bills you think are important to get done outside of obviously the budget and the FRA?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know that I know the answer. I think there's probably 2 competing schools of thought at this point. One is it probably depends on the trajectory of where the COVID conversation is. If we've hit the apex and we've moved down, I think it's probably appropriate for us to move on and talk about some of these other things that we had been talking about, in the past. If we're still in the middle of that, I struggle personally, and again, this is going to be a caucus conversation that we actually have a call today. I struggle to think that we should come back and name roads and do the things that we do when we're in the middle of a continued global pandemic. And so there's some tension there. Could we potentially get past the apex and then have a special session later, and maybe in June. I think that's a possibility. But I think, from my perspective, if I got to wave the magic wand, which people think I do, but I really don't, we would focus on, my dad always said, keep the main thing the main thing. We would focus on what's really important right now, which is making sure that the state, within this season of trial and post this season of trial, has every resource and every capacity to be where we need to be, and then we can talk about all those other things.
I mean, if you look forward, the state's obviously going to have a revenue problem. I think every business, everyone is. Is this make you look at things like Wayfair a little differently? Maybe look at some of the gaming options.
Yeah, I think it does. I don't know exactly how. I think I had a conversation with somebody. Wayfair. Obviously, the double whammy of potentially a revenue issue, and now because everybody's in their house, they're just buying everything online.
Yeah.
It does change the parameters of that conversation. You could present a situation where you pass it without an offsetting revenue cut, but then you sunset it and you give us a chance in once we get past this season to come back and look at it in a more holistic way. I think that's a possibility. But we haven't had those conversations yet, amongst the caucus, and so I don't know exactly where that goes.
Brian and Ashland wanted to know your opinion about temporarily Mizzou. It was odd. I read an article in the Missouri Times where you had Senator Brown from Rolla, Senator Whelan from Jefferson County, Senator Eichel from St. Charles County, all complimenting the University of Missouri on the decision to merge the chancellor of the Columbia campus with the president of the system temporarily. You normally don't see Mizzou praised roundly.
Yeah. It's always good when it happens because it doesn't happen very often. So anytime it's good for me. I think it was the right thing to do. Obviously, I think the variables around Dr. Cartwright leaving, maybe that was a very quick process, and so you won't find, or I haven't found, and your point affirms it. Anybody who has anything bad to say about Dr. Choi, his work ethic, his leadership capacity, and so there have been people around here who have thought for a long time that those two positions should be merged. What it actually does for in Columbia is much less felt than the potential changes at the other three campuses. Potentially, if you did that in a permanent fashion, they'd have to have some more autonomy. There would be a different way that those things would play out. But in Columbia, I don't know that anybody would honestly know the difference.
Just ask you a question about that. If you were a person in academia and you were aggressive and willing to move your career forward, I viewed it was hard for Cartwright to be seen in his own light with Moon Choi, a very charismatic leader, technically above him in the food chain and right in your town. A situation that UMKC, UMSL, and Missouri S&T, they don't have because they're 2 hours away, an hour away. I wonder if you can really get top flight people that you'd want to fill that chancellor role in the current setup, and if it's not destined to be this way.
That's a good point. And when people always ask me about the two of them, Dr. Choi, Dr. Cartwright, obviously anybody knows them. Very different people, very different personalities, both good at what they do, both obviously with tremendous backgrounds in leadership and academia. But just different, Dr. Choi is outgoing, way out front, funny guy, very charismatic. Dr. Cartwright was a little more introverted than most people would assume, and that you would need to be in a role like that, but he did it well and came across as very genuine, and so there was an element to that.
But I understand why he wanted to leave.
Yeah, and Central Florida is a massive school. I mean, I think some people don't realize how big of a school that is, fourth biggest in the country, so... I wish him the best, and I think we'll be fine. And if this is the thing that keeps consistent leadership in place, then I'm absolutely fine with it.
Brian in St. Louis wanted to know, there was a shared parenting bill that's come up a lot of times. Mm-hmm. That seems to me like one of those bills that might have had a chance this session, but with the extenuating circumstances, kind of hard to go to in the middle of an epidemic.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I won't close the door on anything because again, we could see a massive downtick. You could see some vaccine come out of the clear blue sky sooner than later. A bunch of things can happen. So I think it's the fear of the unknown that we're worried about at this point. But yeah, I think probably those there's 2 or 3 tiers of issues usually that we deal with, and those tier 2 or 3 issues, it'll be tough, at least in the moment, to really be able to give those much room.
So I had a question here. This is from Will in Jefferson City, but let me break it down just a little bit.
Yeah.
If you look forward, you have access to information other people don't. If you look kind of forward to the next 2 weeks, what does that hold? In Missouri, the response has seen pretty similar results in states our size. Different states doing different things.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much everybody's in a similar boat. Where do you see this? Where do you see this going over the next 2 weeks? Do you see this as an apex we're going to reach within that time frame? Do you see people being able to get back to their lives in the short term, or is this people are going to be at home for another month?
Yeah, I don't think we see the apex soon. I hope we do. I think the numbers we have pretty much done what they were expected to do for the most part. I think our numbers have been interesting in that Kansas City cases are relatively low as far as population density there. St. Louis County is a little bit high based on what I've seen. Boone County I think is probably where you would think it would be, and obviously there's more in urban centers and rural areas. I don't know what the next 2 weeks look like. I think if folks, there is going to be a balance, and President Trump tries to find it, and everybody tries to communicate the balance between, living your life but also respecting the fact that this is a real thing and that science doesn't usually get it wrong. And being mindful of the things that we can do as individuals in our own daily lives to help flatten the curve. I'm hopeful that people will continue to practice these things for as long as is needed, because giving away 2 or 3 weeks of your life or a month of your life for the purpose of maybe not contracting it yourself or not exposing other folks to it. There's tremendous value in that. We do have to find, and I think that the rub that people feel, and I'm talking to small business owners every day who are freaking out and scared out of their minds, and rightfully so, is what does this thing look like in a month, and what does it look like on the back end, right? So certainly the amount of money just in huge quantity that the federal government is throwing at this problem is going to help on some level, and certainly I think the small business infusion of dollars I think is going to be valuable for those folks. So you're going to have businesses who were fine on the front end, made a decision to maybe downsize, scale back a little bit. They're going to be fine when they come back. You have a second layer of business that probably was teetering and struggling a little bit before this. They're going to have a hard time coming back. And so, I think the questions we have to ask ourselves as a state and at the federal level is, you generally know where those tiers fall, not always, but I think it's that second layer of folks. If we can find a way to help them build a bridge between, mid-March and maybe mid-June. I don't know when everybody feels normal again. I don't know when that time frame is, but if we can help build a bridge between A and B, while still continuing to recognize that this thing is not going away. It's not going to go away on its own. We have to continue to be smart. We have to continue to be responsible. We have to listen to people who know more about this than we do. I think there is a balance between those two things, but it's really, really hard to find, and I think people have, at every level of government, have struggled, and frankly, I struggle with it. I mean, it's not something that, again, it's unprecedented, and so we know what we don't, we know what we know, but there's a whole lot more that we don't know.
A couple of questions from your constituents. Ron in Booneville asked about how often are you in contact with the governor and his staff?
Pretty much every day. Yeah, so we've had nightly calls probably for 10 days or so that actually the lieutenant governor leads. The governor has been on a couple times. Members of his staff are always on it. We have
Lieutenant Governor's doing a lot of roles connecting businesses to supply.
Yeah, Mike, Lieutenant Governor Kehoe's doing a phenomenal job. I mean, people expected him to do this, but he's working his tail off. I mean, he works harder than anybody in the state. So he's been very helpful. We had a joint leadership call yesterday with House and Senate leadership. Our budget chairman and the governor and some members of his staff, and so we, those are daily occurrences, sometimes multiple times a day, and so I think the communication there has been good, and there have been some input that he's asked of us as far as things that we're hearing from our folks, and we've been able to offer that, and that's been good for sure.
So like if I was in a room and it caught on fire, I would look at Mike Keough to know what to do.
Yeah.
He was just a natural leader that would, if he started giving orders, I'd follow.
Yeah, and the beauty of, you see, obviously I've come across, and we all have a lot of different people in politics, and, the two things with Mike, one, his background, I can relate to, and the fact that, we seek out these positions, but I think when he was, selling cars 20 years ago, I don't think he was thinking, I'm doing this for the purpose of building something to be able to run for office, right? And so I think those more unassuming sense in politics are the ones that I tend to be drawn to. But you don't find many people who don't like him and can't respect the fact that he works as hard as anybody. And so I think he's been a good compliment and a good help to Governor Parson, because Governor Parson, there's only so much that he can do. There's only so many places that he can be in, conversations that he can have. So Lieutenant Governor stepped in well there.
Sheila in Columbia want to know, do you believe there should be a statewide shelter-in-place order similar to other states?
I think it's a hard question to answer. I think the where we are now, I think would probably say that the population centers have all done that. I think Springfield has done it, I believe. Columbia's done it. St. Louis done it. Kansas City, the areas around. I think we're probably, if we can avoid a massive trajectory up over the course of the next week or two, then maybe we don't have to do it. I don't think the governor's taken it off the table, and I don't think he can take it off the table.
This is probably the most diverse state in the entire union.
Yeah, and
Shannon County probably doesn't have a need for a shelter-in-place order right
now. No, and I think what we have to be mindful of, and this is very deep. There's not a lot of people who have the capacity and the knowledge to be able to see things in this light, but the population density conversation obviously is a legitimate one. You're seeing just the chaos and the horror that's happening in New York City right now, because there's just people on top of people, and you can't avoid it in that scenario. What you're saying is true about Shannon County or Texas County. Folks just they're not 6 feet apart from each other all that often, right? They're more like 60 feet apart, right? So that's fine. But we have to be mindful of the fact that when those folks have issues, they may go to the urban areas, right? So if you're talking about hospital capacity, if you're talking about bed capacity, if you're talking about the PPE issues, somebody from Texas County, somebody from south of Springfield, wherever, may end up going to Springfield, and so the rural urban conversation is a real one. But you also have to be mindful of the statewide resources that are available. Are we lacking there? Are we doing okay? Are we not doing okay? Because then I think if we get overrun, at MU Health or at Boone Hospital, because we've got people coming from all over the Midwest because of this massive, or even maybe not massive, but serious spike in rural Missouri, then I think that warrants a different conversation, right? And so I think it's.
And I think people in rural Missouri would respond differently if they knew personally people that were sick, right?
Yeah, and I think I think
you've seen people in St. Louis change from skeptical to
no, that's
serious.
Right. And I've seen, we're talking to folks in Cooper County every day, and they had somebody who tested positive at the casino, and obviously there's close interactions there in some cases, and so they, you've seen the county commission there. There've been a couple more cases, and those guys, all three of those guys in the Cooper County Commission are, way to the right, and you'd think they would throw this idea out the window and say, keep living your lives. I think they're mindful of what could be, and so I think
you have access to the data that someone like yourself has. I think it's a sobering reality of it's not a time for radicals. It's a time for good sense.
You have to. I think any notion that you can move forward without every moment of every day looking at the data, knowing that there's a lot of people that are trying to throw a lot of crap out there that is just meant to be, politically driven, but science is real, data is real, and you have to be mindful of that. And I think, the folks who maybe are at least initially predisposed not to pay attention to that, I think are paying attention to it.
And what's the government really going to do? There's a bill in Texas County, not the state. He did ask a question, what are you going to take people that are going to the store against the order and put them in jail? And 6 foot.
Yeah.
It's like, what are you really going to do? Illinois has an order, and it's the most Illinois thing ever. I actually read it last night. The exceptions for people are 16 pages long. There's really no person in the state of Illinois that couldn't figure out a way that they're in the exceptions list. I mean, it's medical marijuana, which okay, but it's also recreational marijuana people. I mean, there's nobody in Illinois that couldn't go do what they want under the order. It may make a few people feel better, but in practicality, there's no.
Well, and that's what I talked to Mayor Treese. I've talked to him numerous times. Talked to him the day before they made their order public, and we talked through it because I knew I was going to get a bunch of questions. Just wanted to know, and we talked about those exemptions, and the Homeland Security has a set of guidelines that I think they followed for the most part, and so those definitions are pretty broad. And at the end of the day,
what are you going to do?
I asked the question about businesses who don't operate or who continue to operate when they're not supposed to. They would have to be there would have to be complaints submitted. The city would come and talk to them. If they continue to not do it, they could get their business license suspended for a period of time. But you're right. A regular individual that goes to the grocery store to buy food or something like that, that there's not much you can do to stop that, and that's just the way it is. And which it comes back to folks just being okay with changing the way they live their lives for just a little bit, in the hopes that can really flatten the curve and save, literally in some cases, save the lives of individuals around them. I mean, that's a real conversation.
You mentioned Mayor Treese. Looks like he's done. I think the public has responded pretty well to him over the course of the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, he's been fine. I mean, we've had, like I said, I've had numerous conversations. I get most of the conversations that I've gotten from constituents when the shelter home order was put in was. We had somebody who was moving. My wife had a friend who was moving, and they were scheduled to move. The movers were coming, but the movers were unsure if they were essential, And so I texted the mayor, and then I ended up texting the city manager, and he said, "Yeah, I mean, having a roof over your head is essential, right?" And so another conversation about auto dealers who their service department's still open, and if you bring in a car and ends up being a total, or you're not able to, there's no reason for you to keep that car. They can do the work, but then they can't sell you a new car. And so we've worked through some things like that, which that's normal. That's going to happen. But their responsiveness has been great, and I think that's the thing about the second guessing and publicly going after individuals for decisions. I get it, and I understand that maybe 75% of the time those people are motivated by the right things, but there's just not a lot in the moment. There's just not a lot of good that comes from it, right? So the keeping the lines of communication over, talking about the things that you can agree with, or you can find some level of consensus on, because those are the things that if you can do that and do that well, that's what makes the lives of your constituents better in the moment.
Well, I want to thank everybody. We had damn near 100 questions, so thank everybody for sending them in. About half of them were these two. One, President Trump said some things that, I guess it would be me and Steelman were one of the first people that said, hey, this guy could win back in the day. But I'll tell you, I mean, obviously this wasn't a hoax. He was wrong. And he's talked about bringing the country back online at Easter. That's, I guess, we'll know in a week whether that's realistic or not. The response to the federal government, I'll combine both these into one. Everybody asks, when can they get tested? How can they get tested? And it has been my observation that the truth is there aren't enough tests to test everyone that doesn't exhibit pretty significant symptoms. Is that the reality?
Yeah, I think capacity is moving. When we were in that initial stage where there weren't any private testing, wasn't any private testing available in the state, the number that the state lab was doing was woefully small, and everybody knew it. And so you knew you were going to have, when private testing came online, you knew you were going to see an
Are all
upward
those
trajectory.
private testing results available to the government?
My understanding is that the positive ones get reported, the negative ones do not. And that may not be universal, but
sure.
I think that's the.
Well, there's no way you could force labs to tell you results, correct?
I don't believe so. You might be able to get the if it's happening through a hospital, the hospital can do it, right? But so yeah, I think we need to have more access to test. I think private folks have stepped up in a huge way. MU and Boone are partnering with.
But I've seen the state government feel like they were getting supplies ordered that would be delivered on a Thursday. Right?
Yeah.
25,000 masks or whatever it happens to be. The federal government will tell them it'll be there Thursday, but frankly, by Wednesday, New York City's had another 50,000 cases,
right.
and they either didn't exist or they go to the hot spot. And honestly, I'm from Missouri. I don't care what happens in New York. I want Missouri people taken care of.
Yeah.
But I can understand if your responsibility is the nation, you'd send those supplies to the hotspot.
Well, and again, President Trump, anybody in any of these executive positions around the country, these are decisions and discussions that you just never thought you were going to have.
Yeah.
And so, has anybody gotten everything entirely right? No. I mean, I think people have made some pretty glaring mistakes.
I don't think it's the state. I don't think the state of Missouri is mismanaging resources. Anything, they're stretching them out.
I think
they don't
exist.
Are.
I think they're stretching them out as best they can. The utilization of the private test now, I think, has been great. Gene Trait here in Columbia is doing. They were doing about 800 a day. They're going to double that up to 1,500 or 1,600 a day. And so here, there's pretty good access to tests. That may not be true universally, but you're going to have, people are going to have to get tested, and you're going to have to be honest with yourselves about your symptoms and make sure that you're, doing the things that you're supposed to be doing. We're going to get past it. I mean, I think
Well, I see one thing. This one can come from Gussie in West Butler County. There's been some folks that work at Schnucks, Hy-Vee, Deerbergs, that have asked to be treated as essential folks. I think honestly what that would do is you would get masks maybe, but there's no mask to give anybody. Mm-hmm. I think they know that. They've wanted to make their people available to be tested maybe towards the front of the line, not ahead of an EMT worker, but up there. The governor thus far has denied the classification, but it seems like there's some way. I heard a story at Schnucks that the people calling in sick is down at a record low, and I think maybe that's those folks feel like they're doing something for the greater good right now. Is there a way to recognize their service? And honestly, if you're going to have to be at home and stock up, you stock up at the grocery store. Yeah. Is there a way to do something for those folks to recognize what they're doing?
I would say there is, and not a lot. I mean, anybody who knows me has known me for a long time. My dad was in the grocery business for 30 years. We moved to Columbia because he was in the grocery business and was the vice president of Knowles, which was a chain that used to be here in Columbia. So my answer to the question is yes. I think we should do what we can do if there is a change of classification in the moment that is valuable to them for the purposes of accessing things that they couldn't access otherwise. Then I think we should do that because you're right. There's this tug, and I do think that they're probably. And I was in Hy-Vee yesterday, and folks were walking around with smiles on their face and doing everything they could do to help folks. There is an element of just there's policy and there's politics, and then there's just compassion and common sense, right? And so in a moment like this, where we're all struggling to make decisions, to know how to make decisions, the compassion and common sense should almost always trump the politics. It can't always trump the policy, because policy is what it is, and there is a finite amount of money, maybe not for the federal government, but for most everyone else, there is a finite amount of money, and so you have to make rational decisions when it comes to fiscal realities. But I think you make decisions in these moments sometimes that fly in the face of your politics, and that is okay. And I'm not sure when you get beyond this, it's the rub between making decisions based on political ambition, which obviously Governor Parsons is not doing that because he doesn't have any ambition beyond this. Or just doing the thing that you think's right. And I've always I never thought, I say this all the time, I never thought I'd win my first House race. I never thought I'd win my
Most
Senate,
people didn't either, right?
I never thought I'd win my Senate race. I never thought I'd be in leadership in the Missouri Senate. I never thought I'd be on daily phone calls with the governor in the middle of a global pandemic. But not thinking that any of the things were going to be true allows me to recognize that, well, you just do the right thing, because it's what I've always done. Try to do the right thing. If it comes back and bites you and you lose your next election, then I get to go home and spend more time with my kids. So that's okay, right? You know, that's fine. And so that's the decision making tree and process in a moment like this is a tough one, and I don't fault. I'm not gonna. You won't see me calling anybody out for any decision that's made in the moment, because we're all struggling in the same sort of way and just doing what we can to try to make sure that people have access to the resources that they need, information that they need, testing, dollars, whatever it ends up being. We're just going to work our tails off for as long as we need to try to make sure that they have.
Well, Senator, thank you for sharing some time with us. Let's get back to family.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We'll be back Monday at 11 with Randall Williams, Director of Health. You can DM us our questions just like you've done for the last couple of weeks. Thanks a lot.